middleware for you automatically. So what do I mean by middleware? When you do a request, there's different scenarios that can happen. Either it can come back as successful, it can come back as failed request, throw an error, it can come back as a retry request, or it has been redirected. So the middleware stack, essentially what it does is it handles these sort of scenarios that can happen in the lifetime of a request, the request response cycle, automatically for you. So in Kiota we do it automatically for you, which you would have to if you're accessing the API on your own. And then we also support models and serialization. So every API has objects behind it. So for example, the Twitter API, there's a user, there's space, there's channels, there's all those things, and user has different properties and all that stuff. So what we do, if you're accessing the API directly, most of the time you get back response as JSON. You guys know JSON, yeah? Yeah, so you get the response back in JSON. But our library, what it does, it actually does automatic deserialization and serialization of those objects, of that JSON into the different objects that API works with. So you find yourself working with native objects of that API as opposed to JSON or whichever XML or whatever response that you get back. And then of course error handling, how to handle 500 or 400 responses. Any questions up to that point? Yes.
I'm trying to understand what Kiota is.
So, I don't know if you joined late or something.
Let's say if we have like a back end and a front end, right? Where does it exist?
So in the back end, you have APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there are people who want to use your API.
Okay.
If they want to use your API, there are different options. Either they can call it directly using the HTTP library of the language they are using. Mm-hmm. Each library has different HTTP libraries. Mm-hmm. Or another option is if you provide SDKs, then they will use the SDK to access your API. So SDKs essentially simplify how developers access your API, because if I'm calling it directly, then I have to figure out how to authenticate and send my authentication details when sending the request. If I get back a bad response, I have to figure out what's the error message and how do I do about it. If I want to retry request, if I want to redirect request, all those things, I have to do it on my end as a developer. But an SDK that is essentially being generated by different companies, it handles all that stuff for you. So as a developer, I just download the SDK and use it in my application. If it's in Ruby, if it's in Python, if it's in JavaScript. So it essentially eases the work of developing or consuming APIs.
Is it like a way for you to kind of, change your endpoints?
We don't. An SDK doesn't change the API of the endpoints. It creates a library that
for security.
Not really for security, for accessing. For accessing, because if you can access it directly through API HTTP calls to the URL where your API is, or using the SDK which in the backend accesses it. So it's a way to. So assuming I want to build something, M-Pesa and Safaricom have an API for M-Pesa. Yeah. I want to integrate SDK push, for example. I am building an application and I want to support M-Pesa payment. Okay. Now I have two options. In my application, if I'm doing it in Ruby, we have a native HTTP client that we use to call requests. So I can directly call the M-Pesa API. I have to figure out how to pass through in the documentation, how to pass authentication and configure the SDK SDK push. Now Safaricom can make it easy for me by making available what? An SDK. So with an SDK, I download for my language for Ruby SDK. I plug it I install it in my application, and then using it, I just put my credentials, for example, my API key. Yeah, so it will be a Ruby gem, specifically one for Ruby. But an SDK can support multiple languages. There can be an SDK for Python, for Ruby, for C#, for all the different languages. So that is what an SDK is. It makes it easy for me as a developer instead of Yeah, for the API, exactly. Now you get me. So there are different ways to build SDKs. You can build them manually by yourselves, or using the OpenAPI file, you generate them automatically from the OpenAPI file. So what Kiota is, it's a generator. It's you just give it the OpenAPI. So if I'm Safaricom, for example, I just give it the OpenAPI file for my M-Pesa API, and I get automatically the different SDKs for different languages, and then people can start using them. So it came about because Microsoft, we have the Microsoft API that we are building, we were building SDKs for, and since it's growing and it's a big API, we couldn't keep up with manually building the SDK. So we built a custom generator to build clients for the different APIs. So when I say SDK, essentially what I mean is a client, essentially a client that helps you to consume an API. Okay. Yeah, so like I was saying, so these clients already that you create through Kiota already come with authentication, with the middleware, with the models and serialization, and they come with error handling out of the box, stuff that a developer would have to do by themselves if they wanted to consume your API. So basically, this is how it works. You have an OpenAPI file for your SDK, for your API. You feed it into Kiota, and then Kiota generates the SDKs for you. This is how Kiota works under the hood. So what happens is you have the OpenAPI file for your API. You feed it into Kiota. Kiota, what it does, it passes the OpenAPI file into what we call a code DOM. So a code DOM is essentially a representation of how your API looks in code. So your API has resources, it has different classes, it has models, methods, different namespaces, parameters, properties, and all those things. So it passes that OpenAPI file into a code DOM, a virtual code DOM, representing the structure of the API. And then we take that code DOM. We have stuff called the language refiners. The refiners essentially the code DOM is essentially language agnostic. It doesn't care about Python or Ruby or JavaScript or anything. It's language agnostic. So once we take that code DOM, now you pass it through the refiners. The work of the refiners is to make that code DOM language specific. So each language has their own conventions in terms of how classes are named, how parameters are named. Each language has reserved keywords that you cannot use in your API. So what it does, it swaps whatever is language agnostic now with language specific stuff. And then the language writer especially is what now writes the code automatically. So how do you write a class in Ruby? How do you write a method in Ruby? How do you write properties in Ruby? And all that stuff. So these are the language writers. And then out of which all you get your SDK. Any question? So I understand this is a bit of a technical topic. So if you have any questions, please just feel free to stop me or raise your hand and ask a question. Any questions?
So, in terms of just the information that you give it the open API, so this means it mainly works in form of like the CRUD actions. Like the API should conform to the CRUD action. But the reason is I'm trying to understand, especially with the language definer.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have a situation where your API is really weird. It doesn't really conform to the CRUD, the create, read, update, and all that.
Not really. So the code DOM, OpenAPI, it's a very descriptive specification. So whichever kind of API you have, the OpenAPI generators, they usually just give it the URL of your API, and usually it generates the file for you. It describes your API as it is. It doesn't have to conform with. Of course, it's a specification, so there are stuff that doesn't support, but in most cases, it supports how you've structured your API. So you don't have to like have a specific structure. It doesn't have to be REST or whatever. It just takes as it is. And then the code DOM, it doesn't care about how you structure the API. It's about what is the overall look of the API. So the relationships between different properties, the actions that are possible within that API. So the code structure essentially. So if there is a user, what can you do with a user? If there's a customer, what do you do with a customer? If there's an order, what do you do with an order? All those things. So it builds a conceptual model or framework of your API into what is called a code DOM, which is language agnostic. Whichever, even if you eventually want to have a Ruby SDK, at this point it's language agnostic. And then now the refiner is where, when you're generating the SDK, you specify which language you want the SDK to be for. So that's where the refiner will come in. We have refiners for Ruby, we have refiners for Python, all the supported languages. So that's why it swaps out Ruby keywords with escaped words. It swaps out if Ruby supports camel case class names, that's why it does that. If it supports properties with snake case, that's why it does all that stuff in the refiner. And then the writer is just now how do you write, in terms of this is how you write a class. You define a class and then it ends with this. This is how you end a code block. This is how you define a property. This is how you define a method. This is how you define doc strings. All these things are in the writer. So all this stuff is happening in the back end. You don't see anything, and then what you get at the end of the day is the SDK. So it's an automatic code generator. A Ruby SDK that now is fully configured with all the parts of your API and an API client that can use now to access the API. Yes.
So you can have API at the end of the day, you have an SDK to
Yes. So OpenAPI is language agnostic. The API can be, you see, an API, there's no really a Python API. There's a REST API, there's GraphQL API, there's which other specification? There used to be SOAP API. These are all specifications. So the REST is a specification. GraphQL is a specification. So there's nothing like, maybe the underlying backend language is Python, but from when looking at the OpenAPI file of the API, you can't know whichever language it is. Yeah. So it works with any API.
So I have a question. When it comes to the language writer,
yes.
So I would assume maybe you are supporting a few languages right now.
Yes.
So how much work does it take to compare? It's like you're comparing every single language. If you have an SDK for, let's say, Ruby, you have to let everything how Ruby does classes, functions, everything. So how much work does it actually take to do just one? For how long? And imagine that's a lot of work happening.
That's a good question. So if you remember, I came for our last meeting 2 weeks ago, and I was telling you we wanted to add support for Ruby. We didn't have support for Ruby at that time. Between then and now, we have added support. Of course, it's not 100% correct, but you look at what is output. It's pretty. I would say 80 to 90% correct. We are working on refining the small stuff. So one of the reasons we did Kiota is to make it easy to add new languages. And in this case for Ruby, so far we've taken just 2 weeks, and we are fairly at a good point. So it will take around a month to add a language, but that is for someone like me. So I added the Python support, so I'm familiar with most of the stuff. For a new person, it might take a while just to understand definers and writers and all that stuff. But for someone who's familiar with Kiota, it should take less than a month to add support for a new language. Yes? Good question. So what this emits is what we call service library. So it has your models, it has your the different parts of your API and the request builders and the entry point. It doesn't have the serialization, it doesn't have the authentication, it doesn't have the HTTP part of actually making the request and all that stuff. So we have what we call the core libraries. Core libraries are made up of 4 functions. This is the authentication module that will have to, so after you get this SDK, you will have to install those are dependencies, and they are there for every language. So there's a dependency for authentication, there's a dependency for serialization, which is will take the model, and if you're making a request and you're sending it as a Ruby model, it transforms it into JSON and sends the request. And when you get back the JSON response from the API or YAML or whatever XML, it deserializes it into Ruby object. Okay, so that is serialization. And then the third module is the HTTP. HTTP is now where we would have we have the HTTP client for that library, and it is the one that actually makes the network request. Okay. Yeah, so those are the 3 modules that you need. With this one module called the abstractions. Abstractions are like the base classes or interfaces or abstract classes that all the other core libraries use, the authentication, serialization, and HTTP libraries. So this takes your Open API file, generates the models and the request builders and everything, and then now using those authentication, serialization, and HTTP libraries, now you can access the API. Yeah.
How do you handle updates?
So updates, it will depend on you. So for our case, for Microsoft, we have a weekly cadence. So every week we have a pipeline, an Azure pipeline, that runs the generation using the latest Open API file. So what happens is when new features are added to the different APIs, we generate a new Open API file every week. So that new file has all those new paths and new properties and new features. And then using now the Kiota generator, we generate the SDK. So if you update your SDK every week, you'll get the latest update. So it's an automated process. Yes, you can, anytime you want, you can, for example, there was an issue with the Open API file for this week and it was generated automatically. You can go and manually run the pipeline and it will just generate the latest SDK based on the new Open API file. Or did I not answer your question?
In a scenario,
Yes.
and I want to use the API. So if I want my system rejected because someone makes it because of API. So yeah, if I'm using it.
So you see, that will depend specifically on your scenario. If you want the latest every time, you'll have to have custom logic in your application to consistently generate. Yes. But for most people, most of the time, they don't need to update. Most APIs are stable unless they're very rapidly changing. Most of the time, unless there's a major version update or something, you want to generate every time. Yes.
On the status code mapping, so at the end of it, you follow the specification for the Open API when you generate.
Yes. So one other challenge with, like I said, with most of the other generators out there is, Open API is very, very descriptive. And most generators, either they cut corners just specifically for the use case, and they don't support all of the features that are there for Open API. So at Microsoft, what we do is we try as much as possible to follow the Open API spec to the letter. So we support most features that most code generators don't support, some HTTP verbs, some HTTP status codes, and all those things. All those are natively supported. We use it to generate our own SDKs, so they have to be at par with all the features supported by OpenAPI. Yeah. So one thing to be clear is this tool is not, okay, we own it as Microsoft, we are the ones building it, but the goal is to allow anyone to generate clients for the SDK, because every company generates SDKs, or most companies generate SDKs for the API. So what you're trying to do is build something that everyone can use to generate their SDK, as opposed to having to, every company has a team of developers to generate the SDK. So this is an automated sort of process where you just put the OpenAPI file and get the SDK. So it's an open source project funded by Microsoft to work on it. We do it specifically for our own internal SDKs, but also anyone can use it for their own API. So if you have a company, if you work at a startup and you guys have APIs and you don't have an SDK, you can use Kiota and just generate an SDK for your developers.
Yeah, so when you create small team, you like really because we are actually say that have you have a like
Yeah.
like have a
Good question. So you have a small API, which means you can do it manually to do the SDK for it, or people can just call it directly. But what if you have an SDK that you've created manually, and you have, maybe you, at some point in future you want to add new parts to that API? It means you have to go back to your SDK and then manually add those parts. Or in a scenario where you, for example, so if it's a small API, maybe you might not need it because people can just call it directly. It's just two endpoints, or you don't need to. I mean, it's a very easy to start something to do it manually. But number two, the SDK is in multiple languages, so you have to add support for Python, JavaScript, PHP, all the languages. So that means more manual work to do, and to create an SDK for Python and SDK for JavaScript, for PHP, for all that stuff. So what Kiota does is, for the languages that it supports, it can automatically generate for you. And then if you add features to your API, you can just go back to Kiota, give it the latest OpenAPI file, and it gives you a new SDK. So your SDKs will always be in sync, can always automatically generate, and it supports so many languages you can generate at once for multiple languages. So those are some of the benefits. Yeah. Although it's a use case that specifically comes for medium to large APIs, but if you have a small API, there's also no harm in using it. You're good up to that point. So as I've mentioned, some of the benefits using an SDK, it's less work for the developer. I mean, developers are smart, but it doesn't mean that they want to do the work of figuring out your API and how to call it and handle authentication and all that stuff. So it's less work for the developer. We have to automate the repetitive work of adding features to the latest, to match the latest API and stuff. We have a standardized approach for all languages. So whether you're accessing it, C#, Python, Ruby, JavaScript, all those stuff, it's standardized. It ensures quality of your SDK. So if I'm using a Python SDK and I come to my Ruby SDK, to your Ruby SDK, I want them to be the same as a developer. Maybe I used to build using Python, now I'm building using Ruby. This auto-generated SDK means that if I come to Ruby and I download the SDK, it's pretty much similar to what I was using in Python, not completely different. And that's the problem with handwriting SDKs. It's over time you find that there are differences in the clients for different languages. And so this is one way of having a standardized approach for all languages and better quality of the SDK. And then of course it works with any API. So we don't care which company or which API you have, you can use it to generate an SDK. And then there's an option of self-serve. So assuming you're calling the GitHub API and you want a client for the GitHub API, but you don't want a client for the whole API. Maybe you just want to focus on pull requests, for example. Using Kiota, you can specify when you're generating the path that you want the SDK to be generated from. And that's so that with that you can have a very small SDK that you add to your Rails project or Django project if it's Python, and it just works like that. So you can customize whichever size or which endpoints you want for your SDK. So demo. So let me just show you a bit of the code on Kiota, how it works, and then where you guys can try it out. Just a minute. Let me stop sharing. So like I said, let me click it. So like I said, Kiota is an open source project. So if you go to your browser and start Kiota Microsoft, let me connect to the network. So if you search Kiota Microsoft, you'd have the link to the documentation, and this is the GitHub repo for Kiota. In the description, we can show you the language that we support for now. We support C#, Go, Java, PHP, Python, Ruby. Some stuff have not been implemented, and that's what you're working on. And then other languages, Shell, Swift, TypeScript, and all that. Just to show you a bit of the code. So we have what I was telling you about the refiners and the language writers. It's in the builder. So we have path segmenters. Essentially, what they do is they split the OpenAPI file that you give. You give it into the different paths for the different resources that you have on your API, and then we have the refiners. The refiners are where, like I said, you do custom stuff for that language. So if you can open the Ruby refiner. So this is where we specify, how to replace property names and stuff like that with custom Ruby stuff. So we have the language agnostic code DOM, and then this is where you do the specific Ruby stuff. For Ruby, we also have the reserved names. These are names that classes cannot have. We have for every language, but this is specifically for Ruby. So stuff like begin, end, alias, and all that stuff. So what the refiner does, it swaps. If it finds your code DOM and it finds these reserved languages, it swaps them with the escaped characters so that it doesn't match the reserved ones for Ruby. And then for the writers, we have writers again for all the languages. For Ruby, for example, we have the class declaration. So you specify this is how we are going to. This is how you write a class in Ruby. You for example, in this case, you specify this is where the code happens. You say class and then the name of the class, and then you end with if it is inheriting or stuff like that. So that's an example of the class declaration. So we have writers for how do you write a method in Ruby, how do you write an enum in Ruby, how do you write the Ruby namespaces, how do you write properties and all that stuff. Those are the writers. And then eventually what it does is it generates the library for you. I can show you locally how that generation happens. So this is the repo that is I've cloned locally. So for example, to run the generation for Ruby, I have specified the commands to run generation here on the on the launch.json file. So for Ruby, so these are the commands that you would pass to Kiota. You generate, you give the Open API file. It can be a local file or give it an endpoint or a URL where the file is online. And then you specify the language is Ruby, the output where you want it to generate the SDK, and then the name of that folder. So I can do it, and then so let me generate. So in this case, I'm using one of the Open API files for the mail endpoint for Microsoft Graph. So let me launch. So these are the languages that we support: TypeScript, C#, Ruby, all this for now. So I select Ruby, and then I generate. So what happens, you will see it will generate the SDK, and then when it's done, we'll let you know. It's generating. So the different steps are happening there. If I take the code, the Open API file, build the code DOM, refine the code DOM, then write the output on your output. So it has finished generating. So if I go, I specified I want it to in the workspace folder. I want it to output in the samples folder. So if I go to my workspace and look for samples, Microsoft Graph Mail. So it has already generated for you your different. So this is the API client, which has all the parts. Let me just close this. It has, this is the entry point of your API. So it has the different parameters and the different parts that you have. And then we have the models, which essentially correspond to the different objects of your API and the different resources on your endpoints. And then what you have this the request builders. So the request builders are essentially if I want to do a get or a post or a put on a specific endpoint, it would have all those here, the request builder. So this is what the work we've been doing for the last 2 weeks. As you can see, it generates some good Ruby. We are working to optimize it and to look at the different conventions for Ruby so that it generates correct Ruby. Yeah, and then it will be available for everyone to use it to generate APIs to generate clients for the API. So one thing, this is what we do internally as a developer, but as an end user, the Kiota is available as a command line client. So as a command line client means you install it in your terminal and then do Kiota, generate, and then specify the language, all the commands that I listed there. You specify the language, specify the Open API file, specify the output, and it gives you the SDK. The other, what we've been trying now of late is we have an online platform, app.kiota.dev. So this is still experimental, but something we are working on. So what happens is, like I said, Kiota is not specifically for Microsoft. We want it to be able to generate SDKs for any API. So this is a UI where you can come, you search for any API. So maybe WhatsApp, I don't know if they have an API. I don't think Safaricom is onboarded here. We are working with the different producers to onboard. So you can add your API actually if you want. You can add your API so it will appear as long as you have an Open API file. So you can search for any public API. You can search WhatsApp, GitHub, Twitter, all that stuff. And it will give you this option. You can either generate a client or just you want to see the structure of that API. So this is the URL for that API, and it gives the API directory is APIs Guru. So let me see the structure of that WhatsApp API. Let me show, click show. So these are the different endpoints under the WhatsApp API. You have accounts, certificates, contacts, groups, media, messages, all that stuff. So if I want to generate an SDK for this WhatsApp API, what do I do? You come here, you just click generate, and then you specify the language. So we have Go, we have Java, PHP, Python, Ruby. Ruby right now is still experimental because we've not fully tested it. But then you specify Ruby, and it's as simple as click generate. So what will happen? It will generate, and then it will tell you these are the dependencies that you need. So I told you need the abstractions, you need the, so Faraday is the one, is the behind the scenes is the one, is the HTTP client that you use to make the network requests. And then you need the serialization for JSON and the authentication library. So once you download the SDK, you make sure you install these packages. Yeah, and then that's it. You download the generated client, and it comes as a zip file. You can open it. This is the client. And you have your automatically generated client, which has different properties. In this case, for the API client for WhatsApp. So you have an automatically generated WhatsApp client for WhatsApp, SDK for WhatsApp that you can use to access the WhatsApp API. So you can use the online portal here, or you can use the command line tool, whichever you're more comfortable with. But then automatically you have your SDK. So we are what we're looking at is, and then one thing I didn't mention is, like I said, you can filter the paths that you want. If you want specifically only the messages endpoint or the user endpoint, you can either include only specific paths or exclude certain paths, and then just generate your client. So the goal of this thing is to allow, at the end of the day, any API that is described by Open API, you can just come here, generate the client, download it, and use it in your application. And that is where the end goal of Kiota is. So once we finish the Ruby generation, maybe we'll test it out, and then at some point I will come and show you now a live demo of generate an SDK, use it to call the API, get stuff, and build custom stuff. But for now, we are adding Ruby support, Python support. We already added, and the other languages C#, JavaScript, Java, and TypeScript, and the rest. Cool. So let me go back to my presentation. So the feature, like I said, is, so right now Kiota is in preview, so people can test it, people can use it, but we are not saying you can use it in production. It will be, you can be able to use it in production in a couple of months, probably end of next month. And then we want to add more languages. Right now we are adding Ruby, we're going to add Rust, we're going to add TypeScript, and from the community, depending on what people ask for, we'll add those languages. And then eventually we want now to get all the APIs that are publicly available. Right now you can search for Safaricom, you won't find the API, but it will take time to get all those API specifications, add them to the list of available APIs, and then you can just be able to download the client. And that's the end. So these are the different links if you want to, the repo for Kiota, docs, the web interface, and if you're using Microsoft and you want to access Microsoft Graph, that's the link where you can find most of our SDKs. So what you guys can do is, if you have an API, generate an Open API file, use it in Kiota, generate the SDK, see the output. If you find issues, go to our repo, file new issues, and we'll be able to. So essentially, you can help us to make the tool better. So like I said, the repo for Kiota is here. So you can come, you create an issue. We have a list of a bunch of issues. You specify the language, if it's Ruby, if it's Swift, if it's whatever, and the issue that you're having, so that will help us to make the tool better to generate any kind of API. And that's it for my talk. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I want to know, like, how long did you guys get to do this?
So we started in 2021. I joined Microsoft in 2021. As you can see, the name is Kiota. It's a Swahili word. So they asked us, what do we name the project? And we are from Kenya, so why not give it a Swahili name? So this is part of our input in that front. But it's been taking us 2 years to build it. It's now ready for most of the languages, and that's why we are starting now to give demos and show people about it. We have a team of about 7 or 8 developers. Although it's open source, so you can come and create a PR for Ruby or for Python or for JavaScript. It's open source. This tool is open source, but even our SDKs are technically open source. But the team is about 7 or 8 people. I do Python. 2 guys do PHP. There's one who does Java. There's one for C#, one for TypeScript, and one for Go. So those are the languages we support for now. Once we added support for the different languages, so I did Python. Now I'm doing. No. There's a guy from Canada, one from Turkey, one from Costa Rica. But a couple of guys are in Kenya. We have 4 guys from Kenya. Yes.
There must have been hectic for you guys to come up with this, because I see there's a lot of logic there.
Yes. It's pretty hardcore stuff, because you have to understand HTTP and the specification, OpenAPI. What is allowed, what's not allowed, and then you take the code. So if you look, one challenge is the code is in C#. So that's why maybe most guys don't contribute. So we take C# code, and then using C# code, we write Python code using C#. We write Java, Ruby with the writers now and the refiners. Ruby, JavaScript, all the different languages, but the code, the logic is in C#. Yes.
You use the same tool to generate the code.
Yes, it's one tool. It's only that we have. So like I said, if you go to the source code, for example, the writers, we have a writer for C#, Go, Java. So if you open for Ruby, the code is in C#, but it's essentially logic that tells you, how do I write a class in Ruby? How do I write a enum in Ruby? How do I write a method in Ruby? So that's what it uses to actually generate this. So the code that you get at the end of the day is Ruby or Python or JavaScript or C# or Java or Go, but the logic is in C#. Yeah. So what you guys can do is, maybe if you don't know C# and you can't contribute, you can just generate an SDK for Ruby. And then if you see maybe the property names are weird, or the class names are weird, or stuff is not working, you just come create an issue, and then we'll look at it and fix it specifically for that language. Yeah.
It must be like a big project to work on. You guys took like 2 years.
Yeah. So you see, the goal is Microsoft. People have been saying Microsoft is not friendly to the open source community or to developers, and we've been working hard to change that perspective. Right now, VS Code is free, and most people, actually 90% of developers use VS Code. Most of our code is open source. So this is one of that attempt we are trying to bring in developers and engineers to the Microsoft ecosystem. I mean, it's a different company from what it used to be when Bill Gates was running it. Now under Satya, stuff is more open, and stuff is working.
By the way, one
It's
of
an
my
op-
friends,
Yes.
like he kind of made a pull request to a certain big open source project, and he got a good job right now.
Yeah. So see, this is a good
Your
way
name
to.
showing up
Yes.
somewhere.
Actually, one of the people we work with, used to be an work for a different company, but he used to like contribute a lot to one of the projects that they used to work with internally. And then when there was an opening in that team, they just said, but there's this guy who writes code and does a lot of pull requests. Why don't you ask him to interview? And he came interviewed and was accepted. So it's a good way to get exposure and market yourself. Yeah, contributing to not only this but many other open source projects. It's a good way to just, you can put it on your resume. You know, I'm a contributor here and here and here, and it goes a long way in terms of making you appealing for a specific job. Yeah. So try it out. Create issues. Yeah.
Is there any bug that took you longer than 1 day? Or
yeah, there are a couple of bugs. I mean, they're always coming up. Like we have 110 issues. Of course, they're for different languages. But we just keep working through them. And it's right now it's in preview, so it's not production. So use it, but we say with a with a caveat, like don't use it in production. But once it's GA, now we'll be sure whatever it gives in terms of Ruby, it's correct. Whatever it gives in terms of Python is correct.
you guys can use ChatGPT.
Yeah, that's the hot thing right now. You know, Microsoft invested in Open API, which is the parent firm of ChatGPT. It works on the backend on Azure, which is our cloud provider. So what you are doing is actually at some point we're going to integrate ChatGPT so that you can just go to ChatGPT and tell it to generate an SDK for Facebook API using Kiota, and it will just give you the code at some point. We are not yet there, but that's where we are going. So you know, all these things in the background right now, we are working to integrate it in most of our products, even in Office, Outlook, Teams. VS Code, we have Copilot. Copilot already behind the scenes uses ChatGPT. But then if you're building an app or using an SDK that has been generated using Kiota, Copilot will now autofill or complete most of the things for you. Yeah.
It actually makes work easier nowadays.
Yeah.
Instead of going to Google, you just go to ChatGPT.
Yeah. So that's why we have to use it in most of our products.
And it's accurate, actually. Not bad.
Yeah, so that's it for my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too technical. If it was, give feedback to Bernard and the rest, and then we'll try and maybe work with more simpler topics. Yeah, but I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Let's get
Few questions.
into interview.
Yes. Sorry. Sorry, I asked questions.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What were the questions that you got asked like during the interview from Microsoft? We want to land our dream jobs.
Take time to, especially if you don't have a computer science background. Like me, I didn't have a computer science background. Take time to learn data structures and algorithms. There is no shortcut. So, like I said, I had 7 rounds of interviews. The first was with a HR person. They just see how you talk, how you communicate, how you present yourself. They get to learn about your experience, what you're working on right now, and stuff like that. If they like you, they see you can express yourself well, you move to the second round, which is a technical screen. So technical screen is, you go on a call with one of our developers, engineers. They give you a question, and you code the solution live. So they see you coding, they ask you questions about it.
Can you copy?
It's a live call. You're sharing your screen, so they can know if you just copy paste. I mean, all of a sudden code appears because they have to see you typing and stuff, and then they're gonna ask you questions about it. So technical screen you can't copy. None of the interviews can you copy because it's a live interactive sort of thing. The thing is, you don't have to be like, sometimes even the code doesn't work, but you explain yourself well. They see your thought process. They want to see just how you think. So they give you a question and they tell you to come up with a solution. So it's first, don't just start coding immediately. You look at the question, process it, look at the different variables. What are the maybe edge cases that you need to look out for? So just talk about your thought process as you interpret the question, and then start now coding. And as you're coding, explain yourself, I'm doing this, ABCD, and all that stuff. So at the end, you can run your code and it doesn't work. Maybe there's a bug, but he likes the way you approach the question and went through it, and you can move to the next step. And then the next step is now 4 interviews back to back, 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour. Same thing, you have one engineer will ask you about object-oriented concepts, one will ask you about data structures and algorithms, one will ask you about system design, and not theory, it's coding. You code the question. You're given question on system design is more of theoretic, but you describe, how you're going to set it up, database, scalability, reliability, all those things. For data structures and OOP, it's mostly just coding. And then the last one is with your manager, the guy who will be your manager when you join. They can ask a coding question, but mostly they focus on you as a candidate, like what are you looking for, what's your experience. They want to know, just who are they bringing into the team, because by the time you get to the final stage, they know you're good technically, so they just want to know, soft skills and stuff like that, why you want to join the company. And then they take you. So it's a process. It's a long process. Like I said, it took 3 months. I don't know if it's short nowadays, but it took 3 months. So you have to be patient. Don't quit your job. If you have a job, continue doing whatever you're doing until you get back the response. Yeah. So, but keep at it. Just focus on data structures and algorithms, but also soft skills, because they look at, you work with global clients. Some of the people who use our SDKs are multinationals and large corporations, Fortune 500 companies. Sometimes they have an issue, they want to go on a call with you. So you have to know how to communicate to them, how to explain concepts, you have to be good at writing documents and stuff like that. Because those are the things that go a long way. You can be good at coding, but you can't communicate, can't speak, can't, explain ideas. So those are stuff they look at. Soft skills and also technical skills.
Do they have probation period?
No. If you're taken full time, it's full time. Good thing with such companies, they give you a lot of time to ramp up. So like you have like 3-4 months to just understand the company and what you're working on before you actually start writing code. It's not like a startup where you go in today and tomorrow you're writing code. They give you enough time to just learn and understand stuff. It's a big company with thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees. So when they hire you today, they need you 6 months from now. So you have 6 months to learn. A startup will hire you today because they need you today. Because they need you today. Yeah. So there's enough room to learn. Of a Kenyan developer. Hiyo ni AOB.
Hiyo tufanye networking, utupe contracts, endelee na conversation. Two questions hapa nyuma. Leo nauliza maswali nyingi, sasa nataka
Sasa ndio nimekaribia, ndio.
two questions hapa nyuma. Nani iko na swali? Kuna swali? Sawa. Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause again.
So thanks Sam for the presentation. I think it was very informative. So you can just
Type C.
yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
For the application that you are working on for insurance, did it ever go to the market?
They are still there. It's called Kakbima. Yeah, they're there. They actually, so after COVID went, ikaisha, some investors came back, pumped in money. They're still working on it, and it's something that I'm still interested in, because insurance is one industry that I feel has room for a lot of disruption. So I'm still looking at them, but they're continuing.
Since
It's a web app for now. Like, they don't have a mobile app, but they're working to add a mobile application.
so me as a regular client,
Yes.
can I go on the web app and use it to like bypass the brokers?
Yes. And there are a couple of them. There's Was Insure, there's Atkakdima, there's I think Lami. So most people have figured out the problem and they're building different applications for that. Yes.
So I just want to share with you the socials. You can be able to follow us, tweets, and this is where we share a lot of information concerning the meetups, concerning future events. So thanks, Sam. Anybody else have another question? You're good. Was it too technical? Maybe. Feedback? Just the right amount. Okay, that's good to know. But I think it's very informative. I've seen, so maybe for me, I've seen that you go to, you want to use something from a company, and then they would have SDKs for like 3 languages. Now you're working with like Paul over there. He has so many different languages he's working on.
Yeah.
And then if you request, they might take forever to build that. So
Yeah.
now with this kind of tool, this companies can be able to do build this
Yeah.
for us and then
Yeah.
to be able to help us. So I feel it's a really noble cause from Microsoft and changing their image. I think I think they're doing good. Also Microsoft, I think their first step was GitHub.
Yeah.
So I think they're going in the right direction. So that's it. So our socials, follow us, like tweets, whatever. And we normally have these events every second Thursday a month. So hopefully you come again, come interact with us in the next one in March. Yeah. Second Thursday. So I will be here, and not unless the venue changes, then we communicate as well. But we always communicate on the social, so please follow us. And then what else am I forgetting? Anybody else with a question or a comment? How you felt in the session? How we should improve? Anything? Okay, I think we're good. We're good to go. I think Banta will just tell us something, then we can interact and can live at your own pleasure. So okay, let's just wait for him. In the meantime, anybody with a comment?
Maybe something like this.
Yeah.
I'm contributing to the whole Nairuby platform.
Yeah.
We have like step-by-step setup for someone with
Zero experience.
so maybe I just know HTML and I just want to come in and just do that.
Okay, so on that, John, it's we just what we have on the page right now is a readme that helps. Like it's Ruby, so it helps you if you already know Ruby, you can be able to run the commands all the way through. Maybe I can open it up. But when it comes to somebody who's completely new, I think we really need somebody to help us there. So maybe you can add more information, make it more easy to follow. So that it's easy for even a complete beginner. Because whatever we have on GitHub is, I would say it's more for like, for just somebody who knows at least a little bit of Ruby and be able to do
maybe I can help out to answer that.
Yeah.
I think we're also planning to just write more issues going forward.
Yeah.
We try to find issues related to design and also to art.
Yeah.
Because what we're doing, we're using a mix of, I think we're using the Reels music apply and all that. So we haven't been some new content also ticket. Whenever you want to style something a certain way. And so what we do, we just find ways to create smaller tickets where you can pick it up on the list. Do it. I don't think we tried everything in terms of beginner friendly podcasts and all that.
Yeah, actually, that's what he's the leader of the project. So if you have any issues, please talk to him. He has more information, so yeah, he was able to answer that. If you have any questions, reach out to him. And we're on WhatsApp as well. I think there's also a group for WhatsApp for the platform. So if you want to join, you can talk to him, you can talk to me, then you can add it to the group and start contributing. That's where you can get directions, can be directed in what to do. Yeah. So yeah, but John, you got answered. That's good.
Okay, so, okay, what I was thinking technically was,
Yeah.
like, let's say for instance, I don't know if that would be possible. I should say that, like, not set up a big environment on my laptop, just like create an external link. I just like add that there, and then you can go follow that, and then after that, then let's say like tells you when you're done with setting up that, you can come back and continue from here.
Yeah.
I think we're also planning to I believe many people do things and so look is much easier and just do local because it's not using it's not like working on the network. So that one reduces the need to actually install using the computer. But you have like both ways where you can do Docker and you say just use commands.
Yes.
You asked for your comments on how you based on like improvement. I think that you can done with the user next time, but in overall the question will go down.
Sorry, I think just actually say it there.
I'm saying I think that should be at
All time. Yeah. We're really gone overboard. Yeah, that's a good that's a good observation. We're really gone overboard today.
But I think going overboard is good because they really enjoy that.
Yeah, actually, if you notice, everybody was attentive, so the session was good. But I think we should. And one thing you can do, please come earlier. If we start at 6, then the speaker can be able to finish at 7. So that from 7 you guys can interact, you can network with the other people. So now oh yeah, but from now next time also we'll have the meetup there. So yes.
Let's give a comment.
Yeah.
The Nairuby organization.
Yeah.
Was sending the invitation to us. The invitation was just concerned.
Yeah.
Especially to me. We should sit down and listen to the speaker today.
Yeah.
Very good. That's the thing that we have to
Good. It's good. Actually, I think that we should also thank from ARC. We should really thank Nairobi and John for really helping us to get the venue because we normally have it at IHA, but John was able to help us with at least getting this venue and also getting to meet guys from Nairobi. So thank you so much, Nairobi. I don't know if you're going to present it. Okay, so we like to really thank you, and I hope we continue working together. Yeah. Oh yes. So John.
My name is John Wendwa. I am the creative lead at Nairuby, as well as the design, multidisciplinary design trainer for the advanced classes. But let me just tell you what that is here. Nairuby class is a non-profit that was started way back in 1995, right now we're 23 years old. And we've been, so at the first office used to be Salon Therapy. So at the Golden Center, maybe you know the Golden Center, you know that they're construction and everything we have to move to this new location. So what are aerobics do? Aerobics works with CPOs to impact the lives of youth from the resource platforms. And we work essentially when we look at our resource platforms, most of the centers that we work with for our training, they are based in places like so we have centers in Kibera right now, 4. We have centers in Kariobangi, Mathare. We have one that was added in Kangemi, and we have a new one that was added in Kisumu just recently. So the idea is that we get to impact young people with ICT skills so that they can change their lives at the end of the day. And so for that reason, what we have 2 programs basically in that area that we work with. So one is called the Digital Literacy Program. It is a program that where we train young people now from those informal settlements, from the resource backgrounds, in terms of informal settlements. And there's a reason for that because of the growth that we've experienced, and we also got to understand that, for instance, you may have someone living in Kimani, but they're staying in their hands. So that doesn't mean we're not involved in our activities. So that's why we decided to then change the language of the people we serve. And so for the first program, it's called the Digital Literacy Program. And we work with youth from the age of 17 to 24 years old, primarily. And for that first program, we get to learn introduction to computers, digital marketing, money skills, entrepreneurship, as well as online work. So that runs for, right now that has changed, it runs for typically 18 weeks in total. And once that level has of course, there's an introduction into design as well. And right now there's also some introduction into web development, mostly on the front end side. So at least with HTML and CSS to begin with, as well as, let's say, things like Wix. We also get introduced them to things like that. Which, with such skills, you get to earn a certificate, and you can now decide, let's say, to get a job somewhere with that basic skill. After which, the ones that have graduated from that digital literacy program, they get to now advance, to get to join the advanced multimedia program, which actually takes place here. And in this multimedia, we're able to accommodate up to 30 students, of which this year we got to at least push it to, and we have 44 students. At least we coordinate the range, we can squeeze in this space. We invite the participants from those areas to apply and learn. So what they learn here at the end of the day is multidisciplinary design and something called the code lab. So multidisciplinary design will handle different disciplines from UI UX design, graphical part, the graphical bit of design, design thinking and human-centered design, as well as editorial design, as well as right now we're able to introduce motion using under a program called the VIT, video impact training, where students will learn how to tell stories of impact using videography. Yeah, that is most known about display design aspect. After that, we have students who decide to, let's say, they want to do things related to coding. So for them, they get to work on mostly front-end work. That was focused from, again, advancing from what they started learning, looking at JavaScript and React, as well as Node for backend. Yeah, so that is the toddler bit. So all these, so typically after you've onboarded here, that should take 6 months, this class first, and then after that it is followed by 3 months of mandatory internship, this to get job placements with relevant skills of what you learned. After which, of course, now that is followed by graduation. And yeah, I think that gives you an idea. Our intakes work are mostly led by the digital literacy program, which you have to go through the digital literacy program before you can get to the advanced multimedia program. And for that reason, you can only manage to have 2 cohorts of the advanced multimedia program, while on the digital literacy program, you get to have around 4 cohorts with students learning quarterly. Sorry, half a day per day. In this class, we get on the advanced level. In this class, the class is run for full time, for a full day, 8 to 5. Yeah, maybe we also have many other programs, and we don't want to also take a lot of time, but you can actually check on our website. We have many other programs, and we also invite anyone that is willing to volunteer their time, even for an hour, just come and speak to the students around here. It really helps and it goes a long way to one, we are focused very much on exposure, and if you actually have any opportunities and maybe like interns, we also like invite you around so that we can do that together. Yeah, so definitely feel free to check out our website. We have many other programs that are not just, let's say, for instance, for students of Nairobi. We actually have a new program that is called the customer experience program, and for that actually you have to Zendesk to teach and certify on customer experience for for, for people we work with. Yeah, so there's quite a lot we can go on, but definitely I believe that's what I will discuss. So if you actually feel like you can do your time, we can actually catch up after this, and then we can share contacts and all that. You're invited actually to walk in any day you need to walk in. Thank you. That's actually introduction of my colleague.
So that was a very elaborate introduction of Nairobi. I think that breaks it down. And thank you for that. So I think Banter, I like to invite Banter so that we can close off. I think we're mostly done, so I'll just invite Banter and we can close off the
Thank you so much. I don't have much to add. I hope you'll be tweeting. Amo? Don't tweet. You know the people who are tweeting and Instagramming and Facebooking about the event are going to be rewarded. So sometimes we get merchandise and the swags from sponsors. So because the community depends on sponsors. So sometimes when we have swags that we want to give, we can say that these people are very active on Twitter, give them merchandise. So keep tweeting before we leave and even after we leave. If you have an interesting thing to share, you can tweet and
yeah.
Okay. So we'll also add you to the WhatsApp groups, and then feel free to interact there. Thank you so much for coming. See you next month. Let's continue with the conversations online. And I'm looking forward to seeing many PRs on the open source projects. So we have pizza outside. So maybe we can go out, grab a pizza, network. So we also have food merchandise. So you see the Nairobi merchandise. Just go to look at Nairobi. Look at Nairobi. So this is one of merchandise. And it's really good quality. This is not painted. Simama one day of merchandise. Kitu iko sawa kabisa. So we have done an online conference Spotify shooting this one. Sponsors. So and we have some of the merchandise. So if you go to duka.nairuby.org, you see our merchandise. So we sometimes during the events, if we decide to reward people, we can discount it. Sometimes you can give it for free. But if you want to support the community, feel free to go there and buy and order, and then we deliver it to you. I think it's taking time. Yeah, so just we'll show you another time, but go to duka.nairuby.org. That's all. Thank you so much for coming. Let's go outside and grab a drink when we get one. That's all.
Karibu.
That is really impressive. Just the amount of, think about the amount of work that you put in.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Single language.
Every language.
Follow me back.
Ati?
Follow me back.
Naona wewe ndio top contributor.
Tunang'ang'ana.
Umechoka, si ndio? We'll talk more on a day in the life of a developer who works on